Hey there! Tonight the journey takes us back to ancient Egypt, to a world of golden monuments and divine rulers, where pharaohs walked as living gods among their people. But beneath those glittering crowns and carefully painted tomb walls lay a truth far more complicated than the idealized images suggest. These powerful rulers, for all their wealth and status, faced health challenges that would astonish modern observers, conditions that twisted bones, weakened bodies, and left marks that would survive thousands of years wrapped in linen and sealed in stone tombs. So before settling in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if this kind of historical exploration speaks to something inside that curious mind of yours, and let the comments know where in the world this video is finding its way to tonight. It's always fascinating to see how many corners of the globe share this love of history's hidden stories. Now find that comfortable spot, maybe dim the lights, perhaps turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into a story that has waited thousands of years to be fully understood. A story written not in hieroglyphs, but in bone, in tissue, in the silent testimony of bodies that were meant to last forever. When archaeologists first began unwrapping the preserved remains of Egyptian royalty in the 19th and early 20th centuries, they expected to find the bodies of near-perfect beings, the physical embodiment of divine power that the tomb paintings and temple reliefs had promised. After all, every depiction showed pharaohs as tall, strong, eternally youthful figures, their posture perfect, their forms idealized, their bodies untouched by the ravages that affected ordinary mortals. The hieroglyphs spoke of divine power, of rulers who commanded the Nile itself, who built monuments that touched the sky, who conquered foreign lands and brought order to chaos. The propaganda machine of ancient Egypt, sophisticated and thorough, had created an image of pharaonic perfection that lasted thousands of years, an image so powerful that even modern people, looking at golden masks and painted walls, sometimes forget that beneath the regalia were human beings, flesh and blood and bone, subject to all the frailties that biology imposes on every living creature. But the bodies, when finally unwrapped and examined, told a completely different story. A story written in bone deformities, in dental abscesses that had festered for years, in joints twisted by conditions that no amount of royal privilege could prevent, in tissues that showed evidence of parasites and diseases that had made life a constant struggle. The mummies revealed that even god-kings were subject to the same frailties that affected ordinary people, and in some cases, their royal status, far from protecting them, made things considerably worse. The ancient Egyptians possessed remarkable medical knowledge for their time, knowledge that would not be surpassed in many areas for centuries after their civilization fell. Physicians studied anatomy with a precision that amazed later cultures, created surgical instruments whose designs show an understanding of both form and function, and wrote detailed medical texts that described treatments for everything from broken bones to digestive troubles, from eye infections to complicated pregnancies. The Edwin Smith papyrus, discovered in Luxor and dating to around 1600 BCE but containing knowledge that was likely much older, reads like a surgical textbook describing 48 cases of injuries and their treatments, organised systematically from head to toe, each case carefully analysed with examination procedures, diagnoses, and treatment recommendations. The Ebers Papyrus, another medical document from roughly the same period, contains over 700 remedies and magical formulas, covering everything from contraception to treatments for various internal conditions, showing a civilization that had catalogued human suffering and attempted to address it with both practical medicine and spiritual intervention. Egyptian physicians understood that the heart pumped blood, that pulse could indicate health or illness, that the brain was important though they didn't fully understand its function. They performed surgeries, set broken bones, treated wounds with honey, which modern science now knows has antibacterial properties, and created prosthetics for missing limbs. The medical profession in Egypt was respected, organised into specialties, with some physicians focusing on eyes, others on teeth, still others on internal conditions, a level of specialisation that wouldn't be seen again in the Western world until much later in history. Yet for all this knowledge, for all the priests and physicians who attended them, for all the resources that flowed into the royal court, the pharaohs still suffered, and sometimes suffered terribly. Some of their conditions were hereditary, passed down through family lines that intermarried for generations, concentrating genetic traits both beneficial and harmful, creating a biological situation where recessive conditions that might normally remain hidden found expression with alarming frequency. Others developed from the environment, from parasites that thrived in the warm waters of the Nile, from the sand that blew constantly across the desert, finding its way into food, into water, into lungs where it would accumulate over decades, from the intense sun that beat down on a land where shade was precious, and skin cancer would have been common among those who worked outdoors. And some conditions arose from the very practices meant to keep them strong and pure, from the royal tradition of marrying within the family to keep the bloodline undiluted, to preserve the divine essence that supposedly flowed through royal veins, a practice that modern genetics has revealed to be extraordinarily problematic, creating a genetic landscape where recessive traits found expression, where hereditary conditions flourished like nowhere else in ancient society, where children born to sibling parents, or to parents who were themselves the products of sibling marriages, faced odds that no amount of wealth or medical attention could overcome. Tonight's exploration takes us through the lives and health struggles of some of Egypt's most famous rulers, from the young king, whose tomb captivated the world, and whose treasures tour museums to this day, to warrior pharaohs whose mummies show the marks of their campaigns, and the toll that constant military activity took on aging bodies, to queens who bore the weight of both crown and chronic illness, who were expected to produce heirs while managing conditions that made even basic daily activities a challenge, to rulers whose distinctive appearances, preserved in statuary and relief carvings, tell us about genetic conditions that shaped not only their bodies, but potentially their personalities, and the decisions they made that changed the course of history. Each story reveals something profound about the human experience, about how power and privilege cannot shield anyone from the vulnerabilities written into human biology, about how even those who were worshipped as living gods had to contend with the same biological lottery that affects every person born into this world, about how the ancient past, when examined closely, reveals itself to be not a foreign country of alien beings, but a mirror showing us ourselves, stripped of modern medicine and technology, facing the same fundamental challenges of embodied existence that humans have always faced. The journey begins not with conquest or construction, not with the building of pyramids or the expansion of empires, but with something far more personal, far more intimate. The quiet suffering that unfolded behind palace walls, hidden beneath ceremonial robes, masked by the careful art of royal portraiture that showed only idealized versions of reality, suffering that was born in silence because admitting weakness was not compatible with divine kingship, because the pharaoh was supposed to be made flesh. Order incarnate, the living embodiment of cosmic balance, and cosmic balance does not walk with a limp, does not grimace with dental pain, does not struggle with the basic functions that healthy bodies perform without conscious thought. Let's start with perhaps the most famous pharaoh of all, a young king whose name echoes across millennia, whose treasures filled museums and inspired countless exhibitions, whose golden mask has become one of the most recognizable images in the world, whose body told a story that no gold mask could hide, a story of genetic misfortune, of chronic conditions, of a life that was probably marked by daily discomfort and limitation, a life that ended far too soon for reasons that researchers are still debating, piecing together evidence from bones and tissues and DNA to understand what it meant to be this particular boy king in this particular time and place. When Howard Carter peered into the tomb of Tutankhamun in November 1922, holding a candle into the darkness, squinting through a small hole he had made in the sealed doorway, his famous reply to Lord Carnarvon's anxious question about what he could see was simply, "Wonderful things. Gold everywhere. The glint of it reflecting back from statues, chariots, furniture, and the golden shrine that protected the king's sarcophagus, the accumulated treasure of a pharaoh's burial, that had somehow miraculously escaped the tomb robbers who had plundered virtually every other royal burial in the Valley of the Kings, leaving behind only scattered fragments and empty coffins. It was a discovery that would capture the world's imagination, that would make Tutankhamun the most famous pharaoh in history despite his relatively minor historical significance, that would spawn museum exhibitions and books and documentaries that continue to this day, that would create an industry of Egyptomania that spread across the globe. The treasures were breathtaking, each object a masterpiece of craftsmanship, from the smallest cosmetic jar to the massive golden shrines that nested one inside another like elaborate puzzle boxes, each layer revealing new wonders, new evidence of the wealth and skill that ancient Egypt could marshal for the burial of a king. But the boy king inside those nested coffins, beneath that magnificent golden mask with its serene, idealized face and its false beard of divinity, was far from the robust godlike figure that Egyptian art portrayed. When scientists finally examined Tutankhamun's mummy using modern technology, first with X-rays in the 1960s, and then with sophisticated CT scans in 2005 and DNA analysis in 2010, they discovered a young man whose body bore the marks of multiple serious conditions, any one of which might have contributed to his early passing at approximately 19 years of age. A collection of health problems that painted a picture of someone who had struggled physically throughout his short life, who had been dealt a particularly unfortunate hand by the genetic lottery that his parents' sibling marriage had created. The revelations that came from these scientific studies transformed understanding not just of Tutankhamun, but of the entire late 18th dynasty, revealing a royal family whose practice of sibling marriage had reached a point where the genetic consequences could no longer be hidden or ignored, where the physical problems were so severe that they showed up clearly even in mummified remains, examined more than 3,000 years after burial. First, there was the matter of his foot, and it was not a small matter, but something that would have affected every moment of Tutankhamun's waking life. Tutankhamun walked with a pronounced limp, the result of a condition called Köhler disease, which affects the bones in the foot, causing them to deteriorate and deform, the bone tissue breaking down faster than the body can replace it, leading to pain, difficulty walking, and progressive damage that only gets worse over time without modern treatment. The second toe on his left foot showed signs of necrosis, tissue breakdown that would have been extraordinarily uncomfortable, the kind of condition that makes every step a reminder of the body's failing, that turns simple activities like walking through a palace corridor or standing through a religious ceremony into exercises in endurance and pain management. More than 100 walking sticks were found in his tomb, not ceremonial objects meant to symbolize authority, but practical tools, well worn from use, showing signs of regular handling, their surfaces smoothed by the grip of hands that relied on them constantly, that needed their support to manage the basic activity of moving from one place to another. This was not a king who strode confidently through his domain, who led armies into battle on foot, who stood tall and unaided during the lengthy religious ceremonies that were part of every pharaoh's duties. This was a young man who needed mechanical assistance just to walk, who depended on carefully crafted supports to manage mobility that most people take completely for granted. Imagine being a teenage king, expected to lead armies, to perform elaborate religious ceremonies that required standing for hours, to embody the strength and power of Egypt itself, to be the living representation of the god Horus on earth, while struggling with every step while discomfort radiated up from damaged bones with each movement, while the simple act of walking across a room required conscious effort and physical support. The walking sticks found in his tomb range from simple staffs, probably used for more casual daily activities, to elaborate canes with handles shaped like bound captives, or decorated with gold and semi-precious stones, formal supports that were beautiful enough to be carried during ceremonies without diminishing the royal image. Some showed clear signs of frequent use, the wood smoothed by a young king's grip, worn down in the places where hands would naturally grasp them for support, marked by the weight of someone who relied on them not occasionally but constantly, who had learned to move through the world with these extensions of his physical capability, who had adapted to limitation in ways that the official art would never acknowledge. The variety of sticks suggests that different ones were used for different purposes, some for long walks, others for ceremonial occasions, still others perhaps for particularly difficult days when the pain was worse and more support was needed. Then there was the clubfoot, or rather, both club feet, because Tutankhamun didn't have just one affected foot, but two. Tutankhamun was born with bilateral clubfoot, a condition where the feet turn inward and downward, where the muscles and tendons on one side of the foot are too tight, and the bones develop in abnormal positions, creating feet that point the wrong way, that make normal standing and walking extremely difficult, if not impossible, without correction. In the modern world, this is typically corrected in infancy with braces and physical therapy, and sometimes surgery if the case is severe, treatments that can allow children born with clubfoot to walk normally and live without limitation. In ancient Egypt there was no such correction, no medical intervention that could reshape bones and retrain muscles, no treatment that could give a child normal feet. The young king simply lived with feet that pointed the wrong way, that made standing difficult and unstable, that made the simple act of walking across a palace floor an exercise in careful balance and persistent discomfort, that required constant attention to avoid falls and injuries, that meant he could never run, never dance, never do any of the physical activities that other young people took for granted. Combined with the curler disease affecting his bones, with the necrosis in his toe, with what was likely chronic pain from multiple foot problems all affecting each other, Tutankhamun's mobility challenges must have been severe, limiting, a constant reminder of physical vulnerability in a role that demanded the appearance of strength and divine perfection. DNA analysis revealed something else, something that explained much about Tutankhamun's physical struggles and that answered questions that researchers had been debating for decades. He was the product of a sibling marriage, the child of parents who shared not just a father and mother, but all of their genetic material, who were full siblings, brother and sister, producing a child who inherited 2 copies of every recessive gene that ran in their family line. His father, the Pharaoh Akhenaten, had married his own sister, whose identity is still debated, but who was definitely Akhenaten's full sibling. This was not unusual in Egyptian royal practice, where sibling marriage was seen as maintaining divine purity, as keeping the royal bloodline free from common contamination, as following the example of the gods themselves who were depicted as marrying their siblings in mythological accounts. But it had consequences, genetic consequences that ancient Egyptians could observe but not understand, that they attributed to divine will or random misfortune, rather than to the mathematical certainty that close inbreeding produces. The genetic disorders that can hide quietly in family lines, waiting for just the right combination to express themselves, carried recessively by people who show no symptoms but can pass the genes to their children, found their opportunity in Tutankhamun. The close blood relationship between his parents increased the likelihood that recessive genetic conditions would manifest, and manifest they did in ways that shaped every day of his short life. Malaria too left its mark on the young king's body, adding yet another layer of health challenge to an already struggling system. Analysis of Tutankhamun's tissues using sophisticated molecular techniques found evidence of the parasite that causes malaria, specifically Plasmodium falciparum, one of the most serious types of malaria, and not just evidence of one infection but multiple, suggesting that he had been infected repeatedly with different strains of the disease throughout his life. Ancient Egypt was a paradise for mosquitoes, with the Nile providing perfect breeding grounds in its marshes and flood zones, with standing water everywhere during and after the annual inundation, with warm temperatures year-round that allowed mosquito populations to thrive continuously. Even palace walls couldn't keep out these tiny carriers of disease, and royal status provided no immunity to the parasites they transmitted. For someone already weakened by foot conditions, by the various complications of close family breeding, by the general fragility that came from his genetic heritage, repeated bouts of malaria would have been devastating, each infection taking a toll, weakening the body further, creating damage that accumulated over time. The fever, the weakness, the chills and sweats that characterize malaria, the way the disease settles into organs and causes progressive damage, slowly wearing down even the strongest constitution, all of this would have been even more serious for Tutankhamun, already compromised by multiple other conditions, already struggling with basic physical functions, already dependent on walking sticks just to move through his daily routine. Each infection would have been a serious threat, each recovery incomplete, each relapse a step further down a road that led to an early end. Some researchers have suggested that a bone disease called curler disease too affected him as well, causing deterioration in the bones of his feet that would have made his existing foot problems even more uncomfortable, adding yet another layer of bone pathology to feet that were already severely compromised by clubfoot and the original curler disease. Others point to evidence of a fractured leg shortly before his passing, a break in the left femur that shows signs of occurring around the time of his final illness, possibly from a fall caused by his mobility problems, a stumble that a healthy person with normal feet and balance might have avoided but that someone with Tutankhamun's physical limitations might not have been able to prevent. A healthy young person with normal immune function might have recovered from such an injury, might have had the bone heal normally with rest and immobilization. For Tutankhamun, weakened by multiple conditions, fighting off yet another bout of malaria, dealing with the infection that could easily follow even a simple fracture in an era before antibiotics. The combination might have been too much, the final stress that his compromised system could not overcome. Some researchers believe the fracture itself might have been caused by bone weakness related to his genetic conditions, that the bone broke not from a dramatic fall, but from ordinary stress that healthy bones would have tolerated easily, that the very structure of his skeleton was compromised by the genetic hand he'd been dealt. The boy king's body also showed signs of a slightly unusual skull shape, elongated in a way that was characteristic of his family line, a distinctive feature that marked him as his father's son even in death. His father, Akhenaten, was famously depicted with an extremely elongated skull, along with other distinctive physical features that have puzzled researchers for decades, features so unusual that they've sparked countless theories about genetic conditions, about artistic conventions, about what these depictions were meant to convey. Whether this was artistic style, religious symbolism representing Akhenaten's divine nature, or his unique relationship with the god Aten, or reflection of an actual hereditary condition that caused unusual skull shapes remains debated, with different researchers interpreting the evidence in different ways, some seeing artistic convention, while others see medical reality preserved in stone. But Tutankhamun clearly inherited at least some of his father's distinctive physical traits, including a skull shape that was noticeably elongated compared to typical Egyptian skulls, visible in the CT scans and measurements taken of his mummy, a trait that ran in the family and that connected him physically to the controversial pharaoh who had upended Egyptian religion before restoring traditional practices in his son's short reign. Standing in front of Tutankhamun's mummy today, displayed in climate-controlled glass in his tomb in the Valley of the Kings, returned to the place where he was originally buried after spending decades being moved between museums and storage facilities, there's something profoundly moving about the contrast between the image and the reality, between the message that ancient Egypt wanted to send about its rulers and the truth that modern science has revealed. The golden mask shows an eternally youthful, perfect face, serene and divine, unmarked by suffering or limitation, the face of a god who will live forever in the realm of the blessed, who has overcome death itself through proper burial and ritual. The actual mummy shows a young man who struggled through a short life marked by discomfort, limitation, and the burden of expectations he could never quite fulfill, whose body was failing him in multiple ways simultaneously, whose daily experience was probably one of managing pain and limitation, while maintaining the appearance of divine strength and capability. Tutankhamun wasn't a mighty warrior who expanded Egypt's borders, leading armies into foreign lands and returning with tribute and captives. He wasn't a great builder who left massive monuments scattered across Egypt, temples and palaces that would carry his name through the ages. He was a boy who became king too young, probably around age 9 or 10, who tried to restore traditional religion after his father's controversial reforms had disrupted Egyptian society for more than a decade, who walked with difficulty through the palace halls, leaning on carved sticks, whose body was failing him, even as courtiers bowed and called him divine, who ruled for perhaps 9 years before his health finally gave out completely, leaving Egypt in a somewhat uncertain succession situation that was eventually resolved by the general Horemheb taking the throne after brief reigns by Ai and perhaps others. His fame in the modern world comes not from his accomplishments, but from the accident of his tomb's survival, from the fact that tomb robbers never managed to completely plunder his burial, packed with treasures that show us what was lost to tomb robbers in virtually every other royal burial, treasures that give us a window into the wealth and artistry that ancient Egypt could muster for a king's afterlife journey. But perhaps there's something fitting, something almost poetic in the fact that the most famous pharaoh, the one whose face is most recognised worldwide, whose treasures draw millions of visitors to museums, whose story captivates people more than 3,000 years after his passing, was also one of the most physically vulnerable, a reminder carved in bone and preserved in linen that power cannot protect anyone from the frailties encoded in human genetics, that privilege cannot purchase escape from the biological lottery that shapes every human life, that even divine kings are, in the end, human beings subject to the same forces that affect everyone else. The walking sticks in his tomb weren't decoration, weren't just symbols of authority like the crook and flail that pharaohs carried in ceremonies. They were necessities, worn smooth by desperate grips, marked by the weight of a young king who was taught he was a god but who learned, with every difficult step, that he was heartbreakingly human, that his divinity did not extend to overcoming the physical limitations that his genetic heritage had imposed. Moving back in time from Tutankhamun, the story turns to his father, one of ancient Egypt's most controversial and enigmatic rulers, a pharaoh whose reign marked one of the most dramatic ruptures in Egyptian religious and artistic tradition, whose very name was later erased from official records by successors who wanted to pretend his reign had never happened. Akhenaten, the pharaoh who tried to overturn thousands of years of religious tradition, replacing Egypt's vast pantheon of gods with worship of a single deity, the Aten or sun disk, who moved Egypt's capital from the ancient city of Thebes to a brand new city built in the desert, a city called Akhenaten, modern Amarna, which was constructed, occupied and abandoned all within the span of a few decades, who was depicted in art unlike any pharaoh before or after, with an elongated skull, a protruding belly, wide hips, a face that seemed almost otherworldly in its distinctive features, depictions so unusual that when they were first discovered, scholars couldn't quite believe they were meant to represent a pharaoh. So far did they deviate from the idealised, conventionalised images that Egyptian art had used for rulers for more than 1,000 years. For decades, scholars looked at these unusual depictions and debated their meaning, arguing about whether they represented reality or symbolism, whether Akhenaten actually looked like this, or whether the artists were trying to convey something about his unique nature, his divine characteristics, his special relationship with the Aten. Was this simply a new artistic style, a deliberate break from the rigid conventions of traditional Egyptian art, part of Akhenaten's overall program of religious and cultural revolution? Was it symbolic, representing some aspect of Akhenaten's religious reforms, perhaps showing him as incorporating both male and female characteristics in imitation of the creator god Aten who generated life without need for a partner? Or were these images, strange as they seemed, actually showing what Akhenaten really looked like, recording with unusual honesty the physical appearance of a king whose body did not match the idealised template that Egyptian art usually imposed on royal figures? The body that might have answered these questions definitively has never been identified with complete certainty, creating one of Egyptology's ongoing mysteries and debates. Akhenaten's mummy was likely moved and hidden during the period when his religious reforms were being systematically undone by later pharaohs, when his city was abandoned and his temples were dismantled, when his name was chiselled off monuments and his successors' names were removed from king lists, when everything associated with the Amarna period was treated as a deviation from Ma'at, from proper order, something to be erased and forgotten. A body found in tomb KV55 in the Valley of the Kings is believed by many researchers to be Akhenaten, but the identification remains debated, the evidence suggestive but not conclusive, with some researchers arguing that the bones are those of Akhenaten while others suggest they might belong to someone else, perhaps Menkaure, a mysterious figure who may have been co-regent toward the end of Akhenaten's reign, or who may have ruled briefly after him, the historical record being unclear and confused about exactly what happened during this period. The skeleton from KV55 has been studied repeatedly, with different teams of researchers coming to different conclusions about its age, its sex, and its identity, debates that have sometimes become heated as different schools of thought defend their interpretations of the evidence. Still, what can be gleaned from the artistic depictions, from the bodies of his family members, particularly Tutankhamun, whose genetic heritage is now well understood, and from DNA analysis that has confirmed family relationships even when individual identities remain uncertain, has led researchers to some fascinating possibilities about what conditions might have affected this radical pharaoh, what might have shaped not only his appearance, but perhaps his personality, and the extraordinary decisions he made that turned Egyptian society upside down. The elongated skull, so prominent in Akhenaten's depictions and visible in his son Tutankhamun's actual cranium, has led some researchers to suggest a condition called craniosynostosis, where skull bones fuse prematurely during development, before the brain has finished growing, creating an unusual head shape as the brain expands against the limits of a skull that has fused too early, forcing growth in whatever directions remain available. In Akhenaten's case, if the artistic depictions reflected reality even partially, the condition would have been quite pronounced, the skull elongating backward and upward, in a way that would have been noticeable to anyone who saw him, a distinctive feature that marked him as different from other people, that might have influenced how he thought about himself, about his relationship to the gods, about his unique role in Egyptian history. The feminine features, the wide hips and prominent chest shown in many of Akhenaten's statues and reliefs, sparked theories about various hormonal conditions that might have caused unusual physical development, creating a body that combined male and female characteristics in ways that would have been immediately visible and that might have seemed to confirm divine nature, the gods being often depicted as transcending simple gender categories. Some suggested Marfan syndrome, a genetic disorder affecting connective tissue that can cause tall stature, long limbs, distinctive facial features including an elongated face, and various internal problems affecting heart and other organs. Others proposed Froelich syndrome, also called adiposogenital dystrophy, a hormonal condition caused by damage to the hypothalamus that can cause unusual fat distribution, giving a feminine appearance, underdeveloped characteristics, and other symptoms that might match some of what appears in Akhenaten's depictions. More recent theories have focused on familial temporal lobe epilepsy, a condition that can run in families and might explain not only some of Akhenaten's possible physical features, but also aspects of his behaviour, his intense religious experiences, his sense of divine mission that drove him to overturn traditional religion and force Egypt into a religious revolution that would not survive his death. People with temporal lobe epilepsy sometimes experience intense religious or mystical experiences, visions that feel profoundly real and meaningful, sensations of divine presence or communication, experiences that could have shaped Akhenaten's conviction that he had a unique relationship with the Aten, that he was the sole intermediary between the god and humanity, that traditional religion was wrong, and that he had been chosen to correct thousands of years of error. Some researchers have even suggested that Akhenaten might have had Antley-Bixler syndrome, a rare genetic condition that can cause craniosynostosis, unusual facial features, joint problems, and other skeletal abnormalities. Though this diagnosis is controversial and not accepted by all researchers, some of whom feel that trying to diagnose ancient individuals from artistic depictions is inherently problematic given that Egyptian art was rarely purely realistic, but almost always involved some degree of stylization and symbolic content. The debate about Akhenaten's health continues, with new research occasionally adding new pieces to the puzzle, but rarely settling the larger questions definitively. What seems clear is that Akhenaten's appearance was unusual enough that artists depicted him differently from other pharaohs, breaking conventions that had held for centuries, whether because he actually looked very different or because he wanted to be depicted differently as part of his religious program. What also seems clear is that health problems ran in his family, that his son Tutankhamun inherited multiple serious conditions, that genetic issues were accumulating in the royal line, perhaps exacerbated by generations of sibling marriage, creating a situation where physical problems became increasingly common and increasingly severe. Whether Akhenaten himself was seriously affected by genetic conditions or merely carried genes that would cause problems in his children, his reign marked a turning point where the consequences of royal inbreeding could no longer be completely hidden, where the physical reality began to intrude into the idealized world of Egyptian royal presentation. Moving further back in Egyptian history, the story shifts to Queen Hatshepsut, one of ancient Egypt's most successful rulers, and one of the few women to successfully claim the title of Pharaoh, ruling not as regent for a minor son, or as power behind the throne, but as Pharaoh in her own right, wearing the false beard and the crown, depicted in male form in official statuary and reliefs, commanding armies and sending trading expeditions and building magnificent monuments that rivaled those of any king. Hatshepsut ruled for approximately 22 years during Egypt's 18th dynasty, a period of peace and prosperity, of artistic achievement and economic expansion, a reign that was successful by any measure, and that left Egypt stronger than it had been when she took power. Yet for centuries after her death, her successor, her stepson Thutmose III, systematically erased her name from monuments, chiselled her images off temple walls, replaced her cartouches with his own, attempting to write her out of history as though her reign had never happened. An erasure that was so thorough that for a long time modern scholars didn't realise Egypt had been ruled by a female pharaoh during this period. The reasons for this erasure remain debated, with some scholars suggesting it was about gender, about the impropriety of a woman claiming the title of pharaoh. while others argue it was more about dynastic politics, about Thutmose III trying to smooth over an irregular succession and present himself as the direct successor to his father, eliminating the confusing interlude of a female pharaoh from official records. Whatever the motivation, the erasure was successful enough that Hatshepsut's mummy was lost for a very long time, moved from its original tomb and hidden with other royal mummies to protect them from tomb robbers. But unlike many other royal mummies, Hatshepsut's was not identified when the cache was discovered in the 19th century, remaining unrecognised among other bodies until modern research techniques and DNA analysis finally revealed her identity in 2007. When researchers finally identified Hatshepsut's mummy, examining it with the sophisticated tools of modern medical technology, they found a woman who had faced significant health challenges despite her power and success, a pharaoh whose body told a story of chronic conditions that must have affected her daily life, even as she commanded one of the ancient world's most powerful civilizations. Hatshepsut appears to have suffered from diabetes, a condition that would have been difficult to manage in the ancient world without modern treatments, without insulin or blood sugar monitoring, without the dietary interventions that help modern patients control the disease. Diabetes would have caused thirst, excessive urination, fatigue, weight changes, slow healing of wounds, susceptibility to infections, all symptoms that would have made daily life more challenging, that would have required constant management and attention even as Hatshepsut was making decisions about trade expeditions and monument construction and diplomatic relations. The evidence for diabetes comes partly from the condition of her teeth and gums, which showed signs of the kind of deterioration that diabetes causes, and partly from other skeletal evidence suggesting metabolic disease. Additionally, Hatshepsut appears to have had severe dental problems, abscesses and infections that would have been extraordinarily uncomfortable, that would have made eating difficult and speaking sometimes painful, that would have been a constant source of misery in an era before modern dentistry could treat such conditions effectively. Dental problems were extremely common in ancient Egypt, where the bread was filled with sand and grit from grinding stones, where teeth wore down and broke easily, where infections could spread unchecked. But Hatshepsut's dental issues appear to have been particularly severe, possibly exacerbated by diabetes, which compromises the body's ability to fight infections, creating a vicious cycle where each problem made the other worse. Researchers also found evidence suggesting that Hatshepsut might have used a medicinal lotion, or cream, that contained carcinogenic substances, specifically benzoparine, which could have contributed to skin cancer, traces of which may be present in her remains. Ancient Egyptians used various cosmetics and medicinal preparations, some of which contained ingredients that modern science recognizes as harmful, substances that were used for their beneficial properties without anyone realizing they also had dangerous long-term effects. Hatshepsut's mummy shows signs of possible metastatic cancer, though it's difficult to determine definitively the primary source given the condition of the remains and the time that has passed. Cancer was probably less common in ancient populations simply because people didn't live as long and didn't reach the ages where many cancers typically develop, but it certainly existed, and someone living into their 50s as Hatshepsut did would have been at risk, especially with exposure to carcinogenic substances in medications or cosmetics. The combination of diabetes, severe dental disease and possibly cancer would have made Hatshepsut's later years quite difficult, though she appears to have continued ruling effectively despite these health challenges, perhaps a testament to her determination and capability, perhaps also a reflection of how she had structured her government so that she could delegate responsibilities when necessary, maintaining power even when her physical condition might have made direct management of all affairs difficult. There's something remarkable about the image of this powerful woman, dressed in the regalia of Pharaoh, commanding respect and obedience, making decisions that shaped Egypt's future, all while managing chronic pain and illness, while dealing with symptoms that would have been debilitating at times, while maintaining the appearance of strength and capability that pharaonic rulership required. The monuments she built still stand. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari remains one of the most beautiful architectural achievements of ancient Egypt. Her obelisks still point toward the sky, all created by a woman who was silently battling multiple serious health conditions, while outwardly projecting the divine strength and perfection that Egyptians expected from their rulers. Continuing the journey through Egyptian royal health challenges, attention turns to Ramesses II, one of ancient Egypt's longest-lived and most prolific builders, a pharaoh who ruled for 66 years, who fathered well over 100 children, who left monuments scattered across Egypt and Nubia, whose name appears on more statues and temples than perhaps any other pharaoh, who became so famous that later rulers would claim descent from him, even when they weren't actually related, whose reign came to symbolize Egyptian power and glory. Ramesses II, also known as Ramesses the Great, lived to be approximately 90 years old, an extraordinary age for the ancient world, outliving many of his children and even some of his grandchildren, ruling so long that several generations of Egyptians knew no other pharaoh, creating a stability and continuity that strengthened Egypt's position in the ancient Near East. But living so long in the ancient world, even with all the advantages of royal status, meant accumulating the various health problems that aging brings, meant that the body's decline became a prolonged process, meant that the pharaoh who had once led armies into battle and overseen massive construction projects eventually became an elderly man dealing with all the conditions that affect the aged. Examination of Ramesses II's mummy, which was one of the royal mummies found in the Deir el-Bahari cache, and which has been extensively studied over the years, reveals a man who suffered from multiple age-related conditions as well as some problems that were likely present for much of his life. His teeth were severely worn down, ground almost flat by a lifetime of eating bread filled with sand, a problem that affected virtually all ancient Egyptians to some degree, but that was especially severe in someone who had lived as long as Ramesses. Decades of gritty bread wearing away enamel and dentin until the teeth were mere nubs, probably causing chronic pain, certainly making eating difficult in his later years. He had severe dental abscesses, infections that had spread to the bone, creating pockets of inflammation that would have been a constant source of misery that would have made his final years quite uncomfortable. Arthritis had set in, joints stiffening and deforming with age, probably making movement increasingly difficult, probably causing pain that worsened with Egypt's changes in weather, the kind of aching that makes elderly people move slowly and carefully, that turns simple activities like climbing steps or bending down into challenges. His spine showed signs of significant degeneration, vertebrae fusing and compressing, probably causing chronic back pain, possibly affecting his posture, almost certainly limiting his mobility in old age. Research has also suggested that Ramesses suffered from ankylosing spondylitis, a form of arthritis that particularly affects the spine and pelvis, causing inflammation and eventually fusion of vertebrae, creating a rigid spine that makes bending and turning difficult, that causes chronic pain and stiffness, that progressively limits movement as the condition advances over years and decades. For a man who had spent his youth and middle age leading military campaigns, riding in chariots, personally involving himself in battles including the famous Battle of Kadesh, where he claimed to have single-handedly turned the tide after being surrounded by enemies, the progressive immobility that ankylosing spondylitis causes must have been frustrating and difficult, a reminder of diminishing capability, of a body that no longer responded as it once had. The mummy also shows evidence of atherosclerosis, hardening and narrowing of the arteries that affects blood flow, and can lead to various cardiovascular problems, a condition that was probably more common in ancient populations than once thought, particularly among wealthy individuals whose diets were rich in meats and fats. Atherosclerosis can cause pain in the legs from poor circulation, can lead to problems with various organs as blood flow becomes restricted, can eventually contribute to strokes or heart problems, any of which might have played a role in Ramesses' final illness. Additionally, researchers found evidence suggesting that Ramesses might have suffered from a skin condition, possibly related to poor circulation, possibly a separate dermatological problem that affected his legs and possibly other parts of his body, adding yet another layer of discomfort to an already challenged physical state. His mummified body shows that he was significantly bent forward at the time of his death, his spine curved in a way that suggests advanced spinal disease, that indicates he was no longer able to stand fully upright, that his final years were spent in a posture that must have been both uncomfortable and, for a pharaoh who was used to standing tall and commanding, possibly psychologically difficult. There's something poignant about imagining this great pharaoh, who had built temples and fought wars and fathered dynasties, reduced in his final years to moving carefully and slowly, hunched with spinal disease, grimacing with dental pain, his joints aching, his skin troubled, still performing the ceremonies and duties that pharaonic office required, but doing so from a body that was wearing out after 9 decades of use. Yet despite all these health problems, despite the accumulating indignities of extreme old age, Ramesses II remained pharaoh until the day he passed, never abdicating, never stepping aside for a younger successor, maintaining his grip on power even as his body failed. He was eventually succeeded by his 13th son, Meremptah, most of his older sons having predeceased him, creating a succession that was secure, but that skipped over an entire generation, leaving Egypt in the hands of a man who was himself already elderly, already facing his own health challenges, already approaching the age when ruling a vast empire becomes physically taxing. The case of Ramesses II illustrates something important about royal health in ancient Egypt, how even the most successful pharaohs, those who ruled longest and accomplished most, were still subject to the same aging processes that affect all humans, how even divine kingship couldn't prevent the slow deterioration of joints and bones and teeth, how wealth and power could perhaps delay some problems and provide better medical care but ultimately couldn't stop the body's decline. Ramesses lived longer than almost any other pharaoh, but those extra decades came with accumulated health problems, with years of chronic pain and decreasing mobility, with the kind of slow physical decline that creates its own form of suffering. His monuments remain massive and impressive. His name is still famous 32 centuries after his death, but the man inside those monuments dealt with dental abscesses and arthritic joints and spinal degeneration, a reminder that history's great figures were still mortal, still subject to physical limitations, still human beneath the crowns and titles and divine pretensions. The exploration of Egyptian royal health would be incomplete without discussing the broader implications of the practice that created many of these problems. The deliberate policy of close family marriage that Egyptian royalty practiced for thousands of years, believing it preserved divine bloodlines and maintained royal purity, but actually creating a genetic situation that modern science recognizes as extraordinarily problematic. Egyptian pharaohs routinely married their sisters, their half-sisters, their cousins, sometimes even their daughters, creating family trees that look less like trees and more like tangled webs where the same names appear in multiple generations, where one person can be simultaneously brother and husband, where children inherit genetic material from grandparents who are also great-grandparents, where the coefficient of inbreeding reaches levels that make geneticists wince. This wasn't secret or shameful in Egyptian culture, but was actively promoted, depicted proudly in art and inscriptions, justified by mythology that described gods marrying their siblings, presented as evidence of the royal family's divine nature and separation from common people. The practice was so ingrained that it continued for millennia, from the earliest dynasties through the Ptolemaic period, when Cleopatra VII married both of her younger brothers in succession, following a family tradition of sibling marriage that the Ptolemies had inherited from native Egyptian practice, and that they maintained despite being ethnically Greek, despite coming from a culture that generally prohibited such close marriages among ordinary people. The genetic consequences of this practice were severe, as modern DNA analysis and examination of royal mummies has revealed. Close inbreeding increases homozygosity, meaning that individuals are more likely to inherit two copies of the same gene, including recessive genes that cause various genetic disorders. In typical populations, recessive disorders are rare because they require inheriting the problematic gene from both parents, and most people don't carry the same rare recessive genes. But in closely inbred populations, especially over multiple generations, recessive disorders become much more common because the gene pool is limited, because the same genes circulate repeatedly through the family, because the chances of both parents carrying the same recessive gene increase dramatically. The Egyptian royal family marrying siblings for generation after generation created exactly this situation, concentrating recessive genes and allowing genetic disorders to express themselves at rates far higher than in the general population. The evidence shows up clearly in the royal mummies, in the skeletal abnormalities, in the evidence of metabolic disorders, in the shortened lifespans of many royals despite having access to the best food and medical care, in the difficulty many royal lines had in producing healthy heirs who survived to adulthood. Tutankhamun's numerous health problems, traced directly to his parents being full siblings, represent an extreme example, but not an isolated one. Many other royal mummies show evidence of genetic problems, of conditions that cluster in families, of traits that appear with suspicious frequency, suggesting underlying genetic issues that were being passed down and concentrated through close family marriage. Beyond the health problems in individual pharaohs, the practice of close family marriage may have had broader consequences for Egypt's history, affecting succession patterns, contributing to periods of instability when royal lines died out, or when unhealthy heirs couldn't effectively rule, potentially influencing Egypt's eventual decline as genetic problems accumulated over centuries of inbreeding. Some dynasties seem to have been particularly affected, producing generation after generation of sickly rulers, while others, perhaps through occasional marriages to unrelated individuals or through genetic luck, fared better. The Ptolemaic dynasty, despite practicing sibling marriage throughout its existence, managed to produce several capable rulers, though by the end of the dynasty there's evidence of accumulating problems, of difficulties producing heirs, of health issues that may have contributed to the dynasty's ultimate collapse, when Cleopatra VII's children were eliminated by Rome, and no acceptable heirs remained. Modern genetic studies of Egyptian royal mummies continue to reveal the extent of inbreeding and its consequences, providing numbers and data that confirm what examination of the bodies had suggested, showing coefficients of inbreeding that in modern populations would be associated with severe genetic problems, with shortened lifespans, with high rates of congenital abnormalities, with exactly the kinds of conditions that the mummies display. The practice that ancient Egyptians believed kept their rulers pure and divine actually undermined them genetically, creating physical vulnerabilities that accumulated over time that made some pharaohs barely able to function despite their divine status, that contributed to the human suffering of individuals who had done nothing wrong except being born into families that had been intermarrying for too many generations. There's a tragic irony in the fact that the very practice meant to preserve and strengthen the royal line actually weakened it, that efforts to maintain purity created impurity in a genetic sense, that attempts to separate pharaohs from common humanity made them more vulnerable to very human suffering. The divine kings were, in the end, subject to the same biological rules as everyone else, and trying to circumvent those rules through close family marriage didn't elevate them above human limitation, but instead exposed them more fully to genetic vulnerabilities that broader populations avoid through genetic diversity. The mummies tell this story clearly for those who know how to read the evidence, showing in bone and tissue the consequences of decisions made for religious and political reasons, without any understanding of the genetic mechanisms involved, showing how even the most powerful people in their world couldn't escape the biological realities that govern all human life. Each mummy is a data point, a piece of evidence about what happens when populations become isolated and inbred, a cautionary tale written in the physical remains of people who lived thousands of years ago, but whose bodies still have lessons to teach about genetics, about human biology, about the consequences of trying to preserve purity at the expense of genetic diversity. Returning to specific individuals, attention turns to another fascinating and tragic case from Egyptian royal history, though one that comes from a different dynasty in a different era. Queen Amos Nefertari, who lived during the early 18th dynasty, approximately 1550 to 1530 BCE, was the great royal wife of Pharaoh Amos I, who expelled the foreign Hyksos rulers from Egypt and reunited the country after a period of division, founding what is considered the beginning of the New Kingdom period. Amos Nefertari was highly influential during her husband's reign and continued to wield significant power during the reign of her son, Amenhotep I, serving as regent in his youth and as advisor even after he reached adulthood, her titles and honours accumulating over a long life that saw her become one of the most honoured women in Egyptian history, eventually deified after her passing and worshipped as a patron goddess for the royal cemetery workers who built and decorated tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Depictions of Amos Nefertari show her with distinctly blue-black skin, a coloration that appears consistently in various artistic representations, from tomb paintings to statuary, an unusual feature that has sparked considerable debate among Egyptologists about its meaning and significance. Some scholars have interpreted this as purely symbolic, perhaps representing her association with the god Osiris, who was often depicted with green or black skin, or representing fertility in the rich black soil of the Nile flood, or indicating her divine status after deification. But other researchers have suggested that the unusual coloration might actually reflect a physical reality, might indicate a medical condition that affected Amos Nefertari's skin appearance, specifically suggesting that she might have suffered from porphyria, a rare genetic disorder that affects the production of heme, a component of hemoglobin. Porphyria comes in several types with varying symptoms, but some forms can cause extreme photosensitivity, where exposure to sunlight causes severe skin damage, blistering, scarring, and eventually changes in skin pigmentation that can darken the skin significantly. People with certain types of porphyria must avoid sunlight strictly, often covering themselves completely when outside, living a carefully managed life that revolves around avoiding the one thing that Egypt had in abundance: intense sunshine. If Ahmose Nefertari did indeed have porphyria, it would explain the consistent depiction of her with darkened skin, perhaps representing the hyperpigmentation that can result from repeated photosensitivity reactions and scarring. It might also explain aspects of her life story, perhaps informing why she seems to have spent significant time indoors or in shaded areas, why she might have taken certain precautions that would be necessary for someone with severe photosensitivity, why ancient Egyptians might have associated her with darkness or the night. Porphyria can also cause other symptoms beyond photosensitivity, including abdominal pain, neurological problems, muscle weakness, mood changes, and various other issues depending on the specific type. Symptoms that would have made life challenging, especially in an era before modern medical understanding could identify the condition, or suggest management strategies beyond simply avoiding triggers. The genetic nature of porphyria means it would run in families, potentially affecting multiple generations, creating a hereditary condition that might have appeared repeatedly in the royal line if Ahmose Nefertari carried the gene and passed it to her children, though the evidence for this remains speculative and debated among researchers, who point out that using artistic depictions to diagnose medical conditions is inherently problematic, given that Egyptian art was highly stylized and symbolic rather than purely realistic. Whether or not Ahmose Nefertari specifically had porphyria, the consistent and distinctive way she was depicted suggests something unusual about her appearance, something that ancient Egyptians noted and commemorated in art, something that became so associated with her that later depictions, even those created long after her death when artists had never seen her in life, maintained the blue-black skin coloration as an identifying characteristic, as a way of making clear which royal woman was being depicted. The deification of Ahmose Nefertari, her worship by the Deir el-Medina workers and others for centuries after her passing, suggests a woman who was respected and remembered, whose influence extended far beyond her lifetime, who became a figure of veneration and appeal. Whether her unusual appearance contributed to this perception of her as special, as touched by the divine, as different from ordinary humans, or whether it was purely her political influence and personality that led to her deification, the fact remains that she stands out in Egyptian art and history as someone distinctive, someone who made an impression strong enough to echo through centuries. The possibility that a physical condition, whether porphyria or something else, might have contributed to both her unusual appearance and her eventual divine status raises interesting questions about how ancient Egyptians interpreted physical difference, whether conditions that made people look unusual sometimes contributed to perceptions of them as touched by the gods, whether what we now understand as medical conditions were sometimes interpreted as signs of divine favour or special status. The exploration continues with consideration of Ramesses V, a pharaoh who ruled briefly during the later New Kingdom period, approximately 1145 to 1141 BCE, whose mummy tells a particularly clear story about one of ancient Egypt's most feared diseases. Examination of Ramesses, the fifth's mummy reveals unmistakable signs of smallpox, making him one of the earliest well-documented cases of this devastating disease that would go on to affect human populations for thousands of years, until finally being eradicated in the 20th century through vaccination campaigns. The mummy's face and body show raised pustules, the characteristic marks that smallpox leaves on its victims, preserved through mummification into visible evidence of a disease that killed millions over the course of human history. Smallpox was extraordinarily contagious, spreading easily through populations, causing high fevers, severe pain, and the distinctive rash that would develop into fluid-filled pustules covering the entire body. Pustules that were not only disfiguring but also excruciating, that could merge together covering large areas of skin, that would eventually crust over and fall off if the patient survived, leaving behind the pitted scars that marked smallpox survivors for life, instantly identifiable to anyone who had seen the disease before. The mortality rate for smallpox varied but could reach 30% or higher in populations without immunity, and even those who survived often faced complications, including blindness if pustules developed in the eyes, arthritis-like joint problems, brain damage from encephalitis that sometimes accompanied the infection, and the disfiguring scars that covered survivors' faces and bodies, permanent marks of having survived one of humanity's deadliest diseases. For Ramesses V, who probably contracted smallpox in his 20s and did not survive the infection, the disease would have struck suddenly and progressed rapidly, fever and body aches followed by the developing rash, followed by the pustules that would have covered his face and body, followed by his passing after perhaps 2 weeks of extreme suffering. The preservation of smallpox lesions on his mummy means that he passed either during or shortly after the pustular stage, before the lesions had time to completely scab over and heal, suggesting that the disease overcame him quickly, that his immune system couldn't mount an effective response, that whatever other health factors affected him left him vulnerable to an infection that his body couldn't fight off. The fact that a pharaoh, with access to the best food and living conditions and medical care that ancient Egypt could provide, still succumbed to smallpox illustrates just how devastating infectious diseases were in the ancient world, how even privilege and power offered no protection against microscopic organisms, how diseases could strike down kings as easily as peasants, how biological threats were the ultimate leveller in societies that otherwise had sharp distinctions between social classes. Smallpox didn't care about divine kingship, about royal bloodlines, about wealth or status or power. It infected whoever it encountered, and it was often particularly severe in adolescents and young adults, precisely the age when Ramesses V was struck down. The presence of smallpox in ancient Egypt, documented so clearly in Ramesses V's mummy, also raises questions about disease patterns in the ancient world, about how infectious diseases spread along trade routes and through military campaigns, about how diseases might have influenced historical events in ways that ancient people didn't record because they didn't understand disease transmission and couldn't trace effects back to their causes. A pharaoh's untimely passing from smallpox would have created succession questions, might have affected military campaigns if the pharaoh's passing came at a critical moment, could have disrupted trade and construction projects, could have had ripple effects throughout Egyptian society and even beyond Egypt's borders if foreign powers took advantage of the confusion following a pharaoh's sudden illness and death. Infectious diseases may have shaped ancient history more than we realise, their effects written in the gaps and discontinuities of the historical record, in dynasties that ended unexpectedly, in planned campaigns that never happened, in construction projects that were abandoned, in political instability that ancient sources attributed to other causes, but that may have been partly driven by disease outbreaks that weakened governments and disrupted societies. Ramesses V's smallpox-marked mummy stands as vivid evidence of infectious diseases' power in the ancient world, a reminder that before modern medicine and vaccines and antibiotics, disease was a constant threat, a force that could strike anyone at any time, that could end lives and change history regardless of any individual's status or power or plans. The story of Egyptian royal health includes not just dramatic diseases like smallpox, but also the slower, more chronic conditions that affected daily life without necessarily causing early death. Conditions that would have been constant sources of discomfort and limitation even if they didn't directly threaten survival. Dental disease was nearly universal among ancient Egyptians regardless of status, the inevitable result of eating bread made from stone-ground grain that contained significant amounts of sand and grit that wore down tooth enamel with every meal, gradually grinding teeth flat, exposing the sensitive interior, creating conditions perfect for bacterial infection. By the time most Egyptians reached middle age, their teeth were significantly worn down, and dental abscesses were common, creating painful infections in the jaw that could spread to surrounding tissues, that could cause fever and general unwellness, that could even, in severe cases, spread to the bloodstream and cause potentially fatal systemic infections. Even pharaohs, who ate the finest bread prepared by expert bakers, still consumed flour that contained sand, still ground their teeth down over decades of eating, still developed the same dental problems that affected everyone else in their society. Royal mummies show extensive dental disease, worn teeth, abscesses, jaw infections that would have caused chronic pain, that would have made eating difficult and sometimes excruciating. That would have been a daily reminder of physical vulnerability even for someone who commanded armies and built temples. In addition to dental problems, joint diseases affected many ancient Egyptians, particularly those who lived to older ages. The physical labour of daily life, whether working in fields or construction sites for commoners, or engaging in hunting and military activities for royalty, took a toll on joints and bones, creating wear patterns and degenerative changes that worsened over time. Arthritis appears in many Egyptian mummies, visible in deformed joints, fused vertebrae and bone spurs that would have limited movement and caused chronic pain. For pharaohs who were expected to remain active throughout their lives, who had to participate in religious ceremonies that sometimes required standing or kneeling for extended periods, who were supposed to hunt and fight and demonstrate physical vigour as proof of their fitness to rule, progressive joint disease would have been increasingly problematic, requiring them to either push through pain or find ways to modify activities without appearing weak or limited. Some older pharaohs probably relied increasingly on deputies and representatives, delegating activities they could no longer comfortably perform themselves, maintaining the appearance of strength and capability, while privately managing bodies that were becoming less cooperative. The fact that Egyptian art always showed pharaohs as youthful and vigorous, regardless of their actual age or physical condition, created a gap between representation and reality, between the idealized image and the actual person, a gap that must have sometimes been uncomfortable for aging rulers who looked in mirrors and saw their actual declining bodies, rather than the eternally youthful idealized forms that artists created. Parasitic infections were another constant health challenge in ancient Egypt, the inevitable consequence of living in intimate relationship with the Nile, source of Egypt's prosperity, but also home to numerous parasites that infected human hosts. Schistosomiasis, caused by parasitic flatworms whose larvae penetrate human skin during contact with infected water, was probably endemic in ancient Egypt, affecting a significant portion of the population, including likely some pharaohs and other royals. The parasite causes damage to the bladder and intestines, leading to blood in urine and stool, abdominal pain, liver damage, and various other complications that would have made life uncomfortable, and that could shorten lifespans through chronic damage to organs. Because everyone in Egypt had regular contact with the Nile, whether bathing, washing clothes, fishing, travelling by boat, or farming in irrigated fields, exposure to schistosomiasis was nearly unavoidable, and while palace-dwelling royals might have had slightly less contact with the river than farming peasants, they still had plenty of opportunity for infection, especially during childhood before their royal status was fully established, or through activities like hunting in marshlands or bathing in pools filled with river water. Other parasitic infections were also common, including various intestinal worms that were transmitted through contaminated food or water, causing malnutrition, anemia, abdominal discomfort, and general malaise, further undermining health in populations that were already dealing with numerous other challenges. The combination of parasitic infections, dental disease, arthritis, and infectious diseases like malaria and smallpox created a disease burden that affected everyone in ancient Egypt to varying degrees, with even the most privileged members of society facing health challenges that significantly impacted quality of life. The story of one final royal individual deserves attention, not because this person was a pharaoh, but because the health challenges faced illustrate another aspect of royal health in ancient Egypt. Tiye, the great royal wife of Amenhotep III and mother of Akhenaten, was one of the most powerful women in Egyptian history, a queen who advised her husband on matters of state, who corresponded with foreign rulers, whose opinions shaped policy, who was honoured with unusual titles and depicted in monumental art in ways usually reserved for pharaohs themselves. Tiye came from a non-royal family, but rose to unprecedented power and influence, her marriage to Amenhotep III marking a departure from the usual pattern of pharaohs marrying within the royal family. Examination of Tiye's mummy, identified through DNA analysis as part of the same project that identified Tutankhamun's family relationships, reveals a woman who lived into her 50s or possibly early 60s, a respectable age for the ancient world, but whose body showed evidence of the toll that decades of life in ancient Egypt could take. Her teeth were severely worn and showed signs of dental disease, though perhaps not as severe as some royal mummies, possibly because her non-royal childhood might have meant slightly different diet patterns before she entered the royal court. Her hair, remarkably well preserved in her mummification, showed she had beautiful brown hair that she apparently took care of, though by the time of her passing it was thinning, as hair often does with age. More significantly, her mummy showed signs suggesting that she might have suffered from various age-related conditions similar to those seen in other elderly Egyptian mummies, though the exact details are debated among researchers who have examined her remains at different times using different methodologies. What makes Tyr particularly interesting from a health perspective is not just her own conditions, but her position as mother to Akhenaten and grandmother to Tutankhamun, making her a key figure in understanding the genetic problems that appeared in this family line. If Tyr carried genes for conditions that would manifest in her descendants, particularly given Akhenaten's unusual appearance and the severe health problems that affected Tutankhamun, then understanding her genetic contribution becomes important for piecing together the biological history of this family. The fact that Tyr came from outside the royal family, that she represented an injection of new genetic material into a family line that had been inbreeding for generations, might actually have been beneficial in some ways, potentially reducing the severity of some genetic problems that excessive inbreeding was causing. However, her son Akhenaten then married his full sister, recreating the close inbreeding pattern, and when Akhenaten fathered Tutankhamun with his sister, the genetic problems emerged with dramatic clarity, suggesting that whatever benefits might have come from Tyr's non-royal background were overwhelmed by the resumed practice of sibling marriage in the next generation. Tyr's role in the genetic story of the late 18th dynasty is thus important, a moment where the family tree briefly broadened before narrowing again, a brief respite from close inbreeding that wasn't sustained and that therefore couldn't prevent the genetic problems that would affect her grandson and possibly other descendants whose mummies have not been identified or whose health problems are not as well documented as Tutankhamun's. As this exploration of Egyptian royal health draws toward a conclusion, it's worth reflecting on what these ancient bodies and their modern analysis reveal about power, privilege, and human vulnerability. The pharaohs of Egypt were treated as divine during their lives, worshipped as living gods, credited with maintaining cosmic order, depicted as perfect and eternal in art and literature. Everything about Egyptian religion and culture was designed to elevate pharaohs above ordinary humanity, to present them as different in kind rather than merely in status, to justify their absolute authority by reference to their divine nature. Yet the mummies tell a different story, a story of human bodies subject to all the same biological vulnerabilities as anyone else, bodies that got sick, that suffered from genetic disorders, that were affected by parasites and infections and chronic diseases, that aged and deteriorated and eventually failed regardless of the divine status their owners claimed. The elaborate rituals of mummification were meant to preserve these bodies for eternity, to allow the deceased pharaoh to continue existing in the afterlife with full physical form intact. But the unintended consequence was that these bodies became evidence 3,000 years later of the fundamental humanity of people who claimed to be gods. Modern medical technology, DNA analysis, CT scans, X-rays, all the sophisticated tools of contemporary science have unwrapped these ancient rulers and revealed their secrets, shown their weaknesses, documented their diseases in detail that would have shocked and possibly disturbed ancient Egyptians who wanted to believe in the divine perfection of their rulers. Each mummy examined, each condition identified, each genetic analysis completed adds another piece to a picture that shows ancient Egyptian royalty as they really were, human beings, products of their genetics and their environment, subject to the same biological rules as everyone else despite their crowns and monuments and divine pretensions. The walking sticks in Tutankhamun's tomb, the worn teeth in Ramesses II's mouth, the smallpox pustules on Ramesses V's face, the arthritic joints and dental abscesses and genetic abnormalities found throughout the royal mummies. All of these physical traces tell us that power cannot protect against biology, that privilege cannot purchase genetic health, that even divine kings are mortal, vulnerable, ultimately subject to forces beyond their control. There's something both humbling and strangely comforting in this realization, in seeing how even history's most powerful people face the same fundamental challenges of embodied existence that affect everyone, how they dealt with pain and limitation and chronic conditions while trying to maintain the appearance of strength and perfection, how they navigated the gap between idealized representation and physical reality. The pharaohs were not diminished by their health problems. Their accomplishments remain impressive. Their monuments still inspire awe. Their names are still remembered thousands of years after their deaths. But understanding their human vulnerabilities adds depth to their stories, makes them more real, allows us to see past the propaganda and idealization to the actual people who lived and suffered and eventually died, despite all their power and wealth and divine claims. The diseases that plagued Egyptian pharaohs were not punishment for hubris or divine disfavour. They were simply the result of biology, of genetics, of environment, of the unavoidable fact that being human means being vulnerable to the various ways that bodies can fail or falter or struggle, regardless of one's position in the social hierarchy. The practice of close family marriage that Egyptian royalty maintained for thousands of years, believing it preserved their divine essence and kept their bloodline pure, serves as a particularly clear example of how even well-intentioned practices based on religious belief and cultural tradition can have serious unintended consequences when they run counter to biological reality. Ancient Egyptians didn't understand genetics, couldn't have known that close inbreeding concentrates recessive genes and increases the risk of genetic disorders, had no way of anticipating the medical problems that their marriage practices would create. They were operating with the best understanding they had, trying to preserve what they saw as essential about royal identity and divine status, following patterns that their mythology suggested were correct, and that had been tradition for as long as anyone could remember. But ignorance of biological principles doesn't protect against biological consequences, and the physical evidence from royal mummies shows clearly that sibling marriage had exactly the effects that modern genetics would predict. Increased rates of genetic disorders, higher infant mortality, accumulating health problems over generations, physical vulnerabilities that undermined the very strength and perfection that the marriage practice was supposed to preserve. The irony is profound. The attempt to create divine perfection through genetic purity actually created genetic problems. The effort to elevate royalty above common humanity actually exposed them more fully to genetic vulnerabilities that broader populations avoid through diversity. In examining these ancient health problems, there's also a reminder about how far medical understanding and treatment have advanced. The conditions that plagued Egyptian pharaohs, from clubfoot to dental abscesses to genetic disorders to infectious diseases, are largely treatable in the modern world, or at least manageable in ways that would have seemed miraculous to ancient physicians. Clubfoot can be corrected in infancy, dental disease can be prevented or treated, genetic disorders can sometimes be managed with appropriate medical care, infectious diseases can be cured with antibiotics or prevented with vaccines, chronic conditions can be controlled with medications and therapies that allow people to live full lives, despite health challenges that would have been debilitating or fatal in the ancient world. The accumulated medical knowledge of the past century or two, the development of antibiotics and vaccines and modern surgical techniques and genetic understanding has transformed human health in ways that previous generations couldn't have imagined, turning what were once major health crises into minor inconveniences, converting conditions that used to kill into chronic but manageable problems, extending human lifespans and improving quality of life in ways that ancient people, even the most powerful pharaohs with access to the best physicians of their era, could never achieve. Looking at Egyptian royal mummies and cataloguing their health problems creates a kind of gratitude for modern medicine, an appreciation for all the ways that contemporary medical science protects and heals and extends life, for all the suffering that no longer has to be endured because treatments exist that previous generations couldn't access. Yet the fundamental vulnerability remains, the basic fact that being human means inhabiting a body that can fail, that ages, that is subject to diseases and accidents and genetic inheritance, that ultimately has limitations regardless of medical advancement. Modern medicine has pushed back against many of the health challenges that affected Egyptian pharaohs, but it hasn't eliminated human vulnerability entirely, hasn't made people invulnerable to biology, hasn't created the kind of physical perfection that Egyptian art depicted and that pharaohs might have wished for. The diseases that plagued Egyptian pharaohs remind us of human fragility, of the gap between how humans wish to be and what biology actually delivers, of the universal experience of embodied existence with all its challenges and limitations. In seeing these ancient rulers as human, as vulnerable, as subject to the same biological forces that affect everyone, there's a kind of connection across millennia, a recognition that the fundamental aspects of human experience haven't changed, even as cultures and technologies and social structures have transformed beyond recognition. The pharaohs dealt with health problems, with physical pain and limitation, with the slow decline of aging, with the uncertainties of genetic inheritance and infectious disease, with the challenge of maintaining dignity and fulfilling responsibilities while managing bodies that didn't always cooperate. And these experiences, stripped of their ancient Egyptian cultural context, are recognisably human in ways that create empathy and understanding across the vast distance of time. The golden masks and monumental temples and hieroglyphic inscriptions that ancient Egypt left behind show us how Egyptians wanted to be remembered, the idealised version of their civilization and their rulers that they carefully constructed and preserved. The mummies, examined with modern technology, show us what they actually were: human beings, as vulnerable and as resilient as any human beings, as prone to disease, and as capable of endurance as people in any era. Both versions are true, both are valuable, but the medical evidence adds depth and humanity to the historical record, provides details about daily life and individual experience that can't be recovered from official inscriptions or artistic depictions, shows us the private reality behind the public presentation. Each mummy is a person, someone who lived and breathed and experienced the world, who had health challenges and physical struggles, who adapted to limitations and managed chronic conditions, who dealt with the reality of embodied existence while trying to fulfill the impossible standards that divine kingship demanded. Their bones and tissues and preserved organs tell stories that they never intended to share, reveal vulnerabilities they would have preferred to keep hidden, expose the gap between divine pretension and human reality that Egyptian culture worked so hard to maintain. But in revealing these secrets, and showing these ancient rulers as fully human, modern science doesn't diminish them, but rather makes their accomplishments more impressive, their endurance more remarkable, their humanity more accessible across the vast gulf of centuries. The bizarre diseases that plagued Egyptian pharaohs, from Tutankhamun's clubbed feet to Akhenaten's possible genetic conditions, to Ramesses II's age-related deterioration to the smallpox that struck down Ramesses V, each tell part of a larger story about human vulnerability, about the limits of power and privilege, about how biology operates according to its own rules, regardless of social constructions of status and divinity. These ancient health challenges, preserved in mummified remains and now readable through modern medical technology, connect ancient Egypt to the present, showing how some aspects of human experience remain constant even as circumstances change, how bodies remain vulnerable even as medical knowledge advances, how the fundamental challenges of being human persist across all the centuries and cultures that separate the ancient pharaohs from contemporary people, examining their mummies in laboratories and museums. In the end, the diseases that affected Egyptian rulers are not just medical curiosities or historical footnotes, but windows into the lived experience of people who seem distant and foreign, but who dealt with challenges and vulnerabilities that remain recognisably human, that create connections of empathy and understanding that monuments and masks alone could never provide.